Imagine a man walking through a crowded street. People move around him, their lives overlapping in shallow currents, and yet he passes through them almost like something half visible, not because he is weak, not because he lacks personality, but because something in him learned, long before adulthood, to become quietly self-contained. This is where many men make their first unconscious mistake. They look at their own silence and assume it means they're empty. They assume the absence of friendships means the absence of worth. But what looks like emptiness from the outside is often a sealed architecture on the inside, a temple built to protect what was never protected when it mattered. If you've lived most of your life with few or no close friends, it's easy to believe you simply weren't built for connection. Yet the truth is far more complex and far more human. Men like this often aren't avoiding the world because they dislike people. They're avoiding the world because the cost of being open once felt too high. The body remembers what the mind tries to rationalize. Years of holding yourself together without steady support quietly shape your social instincts, until solitude feels less like a choice and more like the only stable room in the house. From the outside, this looks like calm independence, but inside something very different is happening. The nervous system begins to lose what I'd call relational muscle memory, that soft sense of knowing who you are through the eyes of people who see you clearly. Without that mirroring, identity becomes heavier to carry, not broken, not incomplete, just heavier. And because men are often taught to bear weight alone, they rarely speak of this erosion, even to themselves. There is also an unseen tension running through the lives of men who struggle with friendships. Not the cliché of antisocial behavior, but the quieter story of father wounds never named, identities that split under pressure, or a childhood spent scanning for threat instead of reaching for connection. Some learned early that trusting the wrong person was dangerous. Others learned that trusting anyone at all was unpredictable. Over time, vigilance begins to masquerade as introversion, and so solitude becomes both shield and prison. Part of you uses it to stay safe. Another part of you feels the cost, the narrowing of emotional range, the sense that certain aspects of yourself never get witnessed, the subtle fear that if someone finally looked inside, they might not understand what they found. Jung might say the conflict is between persona and shadow, the mask that says I'm fine, and the hidden self that whispers, I don't remember what it's like to be met halfway. If this feels familiar, you're not alone, and you're not miswired. The traits you've been interpreting as social deficiency are often adaptations to deeper psychic realities, adaptations that helped you survive, even if they now feel limiting. Many men carry rare qualities beneath their solitude: perceptiveness, integrity, emotional depth, intuitive sensitivity. But because these traits formed in silence, they often feel like liabilities instead of capacities. As we move through this exploration, I want to offer a quiet invitation rather than a solution. Stay with me. At the midpoint, I'll name the one trait almost every man in this pattern shares, a trait so common, so unrecognized, that many men mistake it for a flaw. But before we reach that point, let this thought settle in your body for a moment. You were never an empty room. You were a sealed temple, and everything inside it makes sense once you understand how it was built. When you're ready, we'll step into the first doorway of that temple, the part of your life where you learn to become your own safe place too early. There is a certain kind of man whose strength was forged far too young, long before he ever understood the cost. He didn't grow independent because independence felt noble. He grew independent because emotional reliance felt unpredictable. Many men who carry this pattern today look back at their childhood and feel a faint, familiar ache, the sense that it was never entirely safe to lean on anyone. If you were that boy, you may have learned to read the emotional weather of the house before you learned multiplication. You may have known, without being told, when to stay quiet, when to disappear into your room, when to soften your voice or hold your breath. And as you grew older, an unconscious rule started forming inside you, a rule that still shapes your adult relationships. If I don't rely on anyone, no one can drop me. Here is one of the illusions men in this pattern often hold without noticing. They assume their independence is purely a personality trait, but what looks like maturity is often a survival adaptation, a way the nervous system kept you from being hurt by inconsistent care. It makes perfect sense. When your early environment teaches you that needing someone is dangerous or disappointing, The body reorganizes itself around a simple truth: closeness is a gamble you cannot afford. This is where neuroscience quietly steps in. An amygdala that stayed alert in childhood will continue scanning in adulthood, even in ordinary social settings. Oxytocin pathways that didn't receive consistent nurturing won't magically trust connection at age 30. What feels like introversion may actually be vigilance wearing a socially acceptable mask. It isn't that you prefer being distant, it's that your inner alarm system learned to fire at the very moments connection should feel warm. And here's a gentle, destabilizing line to consider. What you've been calling independence might actually be an old posture of self-protection that never had the chance to grow into something else. Yet this pattern doesn't only create distance, it also creates a particular kind of competence. Many men like you didn't withdraw from people because they lacked social ability. They withdrew because they became acutely perceptive in environments where perceptiveness kept things stable. Maybe you monitored your parents' moods. Maybe you took responsibility for peace in the house. Maybe you learned to step aside so others wouldn't erupt. These skills made you reliable, easy to be around, even calming, but they also made you tired in ways you couldn't name. Over time, withdrawing became familiar. It was never about fear. It was competence shaped by necessity. A boy who keeps the emotional temperature steady becomes a man who prefers silence over chaos, solitude over uncertainty, and self-reliance over the risk of relying on someone who might not show up. There is also a subtle signal that often reveals itself in adulthood. Men shaped by early inconsistency rarely bond through joy first. They bond through shared struggle. Joy feels unanchored. Ease feels suspicious. But suffering, that feels familiar, trustworthy, recognizable. They trust men with scars, not men with smiles. You might have noticed that yourself without ever putting words to it. Across cultures, stories echo this pattern. In Japanese folklore, the Yamabushi, the mountain ascetic, withdraws not because he rejects society, but because he carries knowledge and intensity that ordinary village life cannot hold. His solitude is not an absence of value, it is a container for it. Many men who became their own safe place too early live in a similar psychological terrain. And here is the confronting line many men pause on. You did not choose self-reliance. Self-reliance chose you before you had the language to say no. But the story doesn't end here. The deeper layer beneath this early independence is something far more intricate, a perceptual sensitivity that the world often misreads. A sensitivity that once protected you, and now shapes every connection you attempt to build. When you're ready, we'll step into that next room. There is a certain kind of quiet intelligence that develops in boys who had to stay alert long before they understood why. It isn't book-smart intelligence or social intelligence, but something sharper, quieter, more instinctive. Many men who grow up with few safe attachments begin to notice everything. The shift in someone's tone, the pause before a lie, the way a room changes when tension enters. What looks like social withdrawal from the outside is often the residue of a childhood spent decoding danger in real time. This is where another subtle illusion forms, the belief that noticing everything is simply how you are. But perceptiveness at this level is rarely innate. It is shaped by necessity. When chaos becomes the background music of your early life, your nervous system learns to read dissonance instantly. Noticing becomes a shield. Sensitivity becomes armor. And even after the danger is gone, the sensitivity remains. Many men with few friends carry this shield into adulthood without realizing it. They feel restless around ambiguity, uncertain around unpredictable people, and exhausted by conversations that require them to filter constant micro-signals. They don't dislike socializing. They just experience it on a deeper bandwidth than most people are aware of. A simple gathering can feel like processing 20 emotional frequencies at once. This depth of perception also creates an unspoken tension. When you see patterns early, you tend to trust late. Men like this often sense the ending of a relationship before the other person senses the beginning. They recognize the cadence of disappointment, the early signs of inconsistency, the small fractures that predict a larger break. Instead of investing months or years into something that feels familiar in the worst way, they quietly detach before anything becomes official. Here is the destabilizing reframe that often shifts something internally. You are not distant because you lack warmth. You step back because you already understand the trajectory. In Jung's language, This is where the exile archetype appears, not the romanticized version of the lone wanderer, but the psychological experience of someone who learned to protect the truth he sees. There is a belief, often unconscious, that goes something like, if I reveal how much I notice, I will lose the relationship. The persona stays quiet, the shadow keeps the observations, and the exile stands between them, carrying truths with no place to set them down. This creates a paradox. People experience you as calm, collected, unreadable. Yet internally, you are gathering data constantly, mapping dynamics, anticipating outcomes. Others mistake your silence for disinterest when, in reality, it is the burden of seeing too much and having nowhere to put what you see. There is also a bodily element many men never name. When someone overshares too quickly or becomes intensely friendly without context, the body tightens. Not a dramatic reaction, just a quick contraction around the solar plexus, an ancient signal that says, this pace isn't safe. That sensation isn't overprotective. It is memory speaking through muscle and breath. Clinicians who work with veterans often describe something similar. Men who spent years reading danger at a glance struggle with everyday friendships because normal ambiguity feels hazardous. Civilian life appears harmless, but the body remembers a world where uncertainty costs something real. For many civilian men who grew up in emotional chaos, the pattern is nearly identical. The external environment changed. The internal interpreter did not. And here is the quiet truth threading its way through this entire chapter. You are not isolated because your perception is excessive. You are isolated because most environments do not know how to hold that perception without misreading it. But perception, for all its weight, is not the core fracture. Beneath it lies another force, something that looks like strength from a distance, but creates its own form of loneliness up close. A moral line so sharply drawn that even small breaches feel like betrayals. When you're ready, we will step into that next terrain. There is a moment in many men's lives when they realize their solitude is not only shaped by childhood wounds or heightened perception, but by something far more grounded, an inner code they cannot betray without feeling it in their bones. This code isn't written in language. It isn't philosophical. It is lived. It is the quiet sense that certain behaviors fracture the self, and once fractured, the pieces are hard to gather again. This is where another illusion often takes root without ever being questioned. Men with few friends sometimes think they are alone because they lack social skills or don't know how to play the game. In reality, what isolates them most is not their awkwardness, but their integrity. They notice the small ruptures that others brush off, a promise broken casually, loyalty treated as optional, empathy performed rather than felt. For them, these aren't small issues. They are signals. Once they see the signal, they can't unsee it. And here is the destabilizing truth that rarely gets spoken aloud. High-integrity men often become magnets for those who sense that stability and hope to extract it. Not always consciously, but consistently. People drawn to emotional grounding often reach for the man who holds it, even if they are not prepared to reciprocate. The result is a dynamic many men know too well, becoming the quiet emotional anchor for people who offer very little anchoring in return. Nietzsche once described the difficulty of walking the path that truly belongs to you. It wasn't a celebration of isolation, but an acknowledgement that genuine values often create friction with the herd. This does not mean the man is superior. It simply means that he is shaped by principles that don't bend easily in environments built on convenience. When loyalty becomes flexible, when truth becomes negotiable, when humor slides into cruelty, he feels the split immediately. Not because he is righteous, but because his internal line is clear. Here is the sentence many men quietly avoid admitting, even to themselves. Your standards haven't only protected you, they have also kept you lonely. This isn't a criticism. It is an attempt to name a reality with compassion. High standards are not the problem, but the expectation that others will show their integrity quickly, before they've earned trust, before time has tested them, can create a kind of invisible impatience. The man sees a breach early and steps away early. He avoids the slow unfolding of character because he fears what he will find. To him, a moment of gossip is not a moment. It is a map. A broken promise is not a slip. It is a forecast. A hint of self-serving behavior is not an accident. It is a pattern waiting to repeat. The mind that can predict danger so well struggles to believe in nuance. The heart that has been disappointed learns to treat all disappointments as warnings. Cultural stories reflect this archetype with surprising accuracy. Characters like Geralt in The Witcher or Max in Mad Max are not isolated because they lack charm or courage. They are isolated because their environments consistently punish integrity. Their solitude is not self-pity. It is the cost of refusing to collapse their principles for the comfort of belonging. And perhaps you felt something similar, a sense that connection often requires a small bending of the self, and bending even slightly feels like losing something essential. Many men in this pattern would rather stand alone than contort themselves into shapes that no longer feel true. There is a dignity in that, but also a weight. Here is the line that often creates a pause. The very clarity that protects your soul may be the same clarity that prevents others from getting close enough to see it. This tension leads to the next layer of the pattern, one even more complex than integrity. A paradox that shapes how men attach, withdraw, and protect themselves. Not the refusal to have needs, but the fear of what happens when those needs become real. When you're ready, we will step into that paradox. There is a moment in many men's lives when they begin to realize that their distance from others isn't driven only by perception or integrity. Beneath both of those layers lies something more tender, more private, and more human. A deep fear of dependence shaped by a history that once made dependence feel dangerous. Many men who live with few friendships today were, at some earlier point, profoundly attached to someone who later disappeared in a way that left an imprint. Sometimes it was a parent whose emotions fluctuated like weather. Sometimes it was a friendship that broke without explanation. Sometimes it was a first love who held their heart too tightly and then let it drop. From the outside, it seems like these men feel nothing. But the truth is far more complex. They feel intensely, often more intensely than the people around them. What they fear is not emotional experience. What they fear is emotional annihilation, that sense of losing themselves when someone becomes too important. So the psyche does something quietly protective. It decides that needing nothing is safer than needing even one person too much. This is the moment when autonomy shifts from being a skill into becoming a shield. In psychological theory, autonomy, competence, and relatedness all develop together. But when relatedness becomes paired with danger, autonomy can become overdeveloped, almost worshipped. Success then becomes measured not by depth of connection, but by self-sufficiency. The man becomes proud of never asking for support, never being a burden, never relying on anyone's steadiness. On the surface, this looks like strength. Underneath, it often reflects a fear of what might happen if the structure of another person were ever allowed to matter again. Here is a subtle reframe that often unsettles men in this pattern, not because it criticizes them, but because it names something they've long felt, but rarely said aloud. The self you show the world is calm precisely because you have never given anyone permission to disrupt it. Yet something else is happening beneath that calm. While these men appear emotionally unavailable, internally they are often wide open. They feel more than they express. They imagine more than they reveal. They notice small details that awaken large emotions. But since their early experiences taught them that emotion can be used against them or abandoned when it becomes inconvenient, they keep their richest inner life sealed behind quiet control. It is not that they lack vulnerability. It is that their vulnerability has no safe place to land. Across cultural conversations, this theme repeats itself. A man once wrote, "I do not fear being alone. I fear what I become when I'm attached." The silence around that sentence was revealing. Men from all backgrounds understood it immediately. It wasn't fear of commitment or fear of intimacy. It was fear of the self they lose contact with when someone gains too much emotional power. For some men, closeness feels like surrendering control of the one thing they've always been able to rely on, themselves. Another layer of this paradox shows up in a subtle but powerful way. Men shaped by attachment wounds sometimes avoid the exact people who make them feel safe. Not because the safety is false, but because safety feels unfamiliar. In their nervous system, calmness often precedes loss. Warmth often precedes betrayal. Being understood often precedes being left. The body keeps a record of these associations long after the mind has tried to move on. So when someone brings genuine steadiness into their life, a quiet fear emerges. This is how it felt before everything fell apart. Here is the line many men feel but rarely articulate. The one thing you long for is the one thing your nervous system has learned to fear. This is not failure, it is conditioning. But conditioning, when left unexplored, becomes identity. Men begin to see themselves as lone wolves, as minimalists, as people who simply don't need much. And sometimes they don't realize that this story was formed not by preference, but by pain. The solitude becomes familiar, the familiar becomes comfortable, and comfort becomes a home, even when part of them wonders what it might feel like to be known without being overwhelmed. This brings us to something quieter, deeper, and far more generative, the trait that sits beneath all the others. The depth that protects these men, isolates them, and makes them unforgettable to the few who ever earn their trust. When you're ready, we will begin the turning point of this entire exploration. There is a point in a man's inner life where everything we've explored so far begins to converge. The early self-reliance, the hyper-perception, the strict moral line, the fear of needing too much. And beneath all of it lies a depth that most people never witness. Not because the man is hiding it out of pride, and not because he believes others cannot understand it, but because he has learned that revealing his inner world rarely leads to reciprocity. It often leads to misunderstanding, overwhelm, or quiet distance. Many men who live with few friendships carry minds that operate in long form. While the world speaks in short clips and surface conversations, their thoughts move like slow rivers, gathering meaning over time. They think in patterns, in story arcs, in questions about purpose, loyalty, and mortality. They feel things before they can articulate them. They connect dots others never even notice. And yet they often sit silently in rooms where the conversation never touches anything real. This creates a particular kind of tension, one that rarely gets named. A man with depth begins to feel as though he must compress himself to fit into the available social spaces. He becomes careful with his language. He becomes cautious with his inner richness. He hides his curiosity, his intensity, his seriousness, not because he is ashamed, but because he senses the room cannot hold it. What he calls not wanting to overwhelm anyone is often a deeper truth. He does not want to experience the look of disinterest or confusion that follows genuine expression. Jung described the split between the self, the full, integrated, authentic inner world, and the persona, the mask we wear to remain socially acceptable. For many men with few friends, the persona is intentionally lightweight because the self feels too heavy to carry into most relationships. The man thinks, if I show the real architecture of my mind, I will burden people. If I reveal the depth I carry, they will step back. And so he presents a simplified version of himself, a quieter version, one that is easier for others to digest. Here is the midpoint reversal, the moment that often changes the way men understand themselves. People do not avoid you because you are empty. They step back because you are emotionally and psychologically transparent in ways that unsettle them. It is not aloofness. It is clarity. It is not dullness. It is depth. It is not emotional coldness. It is the ability to see beneath the surface without effort. Most people experience this kind of presence as unusual. They may not have language for it, but they feel it. When a person who carries depth walks into a conversation, others often sense a subtle shift. This is someone who is not easily fooled by performance, who listens with sincerity, who notices energy more than words. For many, this is disarming. Some respond by opening up quickly, sometimes too quickly. Others respond by retreating. There is a phenomenon men in this pattern rarely name: strangers confiding deep, personal truths within minutes. It happens at work, at gatherings, in unexpected places. Someone begins speaking about grief, addiction, fear, childhood wounds. The man listens, not because he wants to be the container, but because he knows how to hold silence without rushing it. People sense this stability and offer parts of themselves they rarely reveal. And yet, after the confession, the dynamic often fades. The person who opened up steps back, uncertain how to maintain connection with someone who feels so steady, so grounded, so perceptive. The man who listened is left carrying a story that was never his to keep, while his own depth remains unseen. This repeated pattern can create a quiet ache, the ache of being a safe place for others, but rarely feeling safe enough to be fully known. A scene from the film Whiplash mirrors this paradox. Andrew's isolation fuels his mastery, and his mastery deepens his isolation. His intensity creates results, but narrows his relational world. Many men with deep inner landscapes experience a similar loop. The very qualities that make them exceptional, focus, clarity, introspection, perceptiveness, make it difficult to find people who can join them without feeling overwhelmed or inadequate. And here is the line that often lands with precision. The world benefits from your depth far more easily than it knows how to meet it. This realization is not meant to create pride or resignation. It is meant to name the lived experience with honesty. Depth is not the problem. The absence of environments capable of receiving it is the problem. If you want to explore this internally, one quiet experiment can be useful, not as a directive, but as an option. Tonight or sometime soon, consider noticing one moment where you dimmed your depth to remain relatable. Notice it without judgment. Then, imagine what it might feel like to let that depth breathe, not necessarily with another person, but in a journal, a thought, or a private reflection. This is not about disclosure. It is about remembering that your depth has a right to exist, even when it is unseen. We are approaching the final movement of this exploration, the place where all the threads begin to weave together. The last chapter will return to the metaphor we opened with, the sealed temple, and explore what it means for such a place to open, not for the world, but for the few who know how to knock with reverence. As we reach the final movement of this exploration, return for a moment to the image we began with, the sealed temple standing quietly at the edge of a crowded world. From a distance, it appears abandoned. No light in the windows, no music in the halls, no footsteps behind the heavy doors. People assume there is nothing inside, or nothing worth opening. Yet the truth is almost always the opposite. A temple is sealed not because it is empty, but because the interior is sacred. Many men who live with few friendships feel as though they themselves are this structure, outwardly quiet, inwardly full, carrying artifacts of loyalty, insight, resilience, and depth that were never carefully held by anyone else. The exterior becomes protective, the interior becomes private, and over time, the world mistakes protection for absence. But the journey we've taken tonight reveals something else. Solitude in these men is not a simple preference. It is an adaptation. Beneath it lie layers that formed out of necessity, becoming their own safe place too early, perceiving more than the environment could hold, maintaining a moral code in spaces where values shifted like weather, guarding themselves from the fear of needing too much, and moving through life with a depth that few people know how to meet without retreating. These traits do not make a man broken, they make him complex. And here is a gentle reframe that often changes how men see their own path. The very qualities that have distanced you are the same qualities that make you unforgettable to the right people. If you have ever wondered why certain individuals remember you long after you've forgotten the interaction, it is because you brought sincerity into a moment that usually holds none. If you have ever noticed that the people who truly connect with you do so slowly, it is because depth requires time, not performance. This does not mean that isolation should be romanticized. Being a sealed temple is a beautiful metaphor, but no temple is built to remain unopened forever. Yet the solution is not to fling the doors wide or force yourself into social spaces that feel misaligned. The path forward is measured, selective openness, not with everyone, and not all at once, but with people who show consistency, patience, and genuine curiosity. People whose presence feels like they are entering, not intruding. The psychological loop closes here. Your solitude was shaped by wounds, but it is also shaped by gifts. Your vigilance was born in difficulty, but it became insight. Your standards grew from pain, but they now form your integrity. Your self-reliance once protected you, but it also revealed your capacity for endurance. And your depth, the part so few have seen, is not a burden. It is the interior of the temple itself. There is one final recognition worth lingering on. When the right person approaches, whether a friend, a partner, a mentor, or a rare kindred soul, they will not try to force the doors open. They will approach quietly, with the kind of presence that communicates patience rather than urgency. And something in you will recognize that, not because you suddenly feel safe, but because their steadiness meets your depth instead of fearing it. The temple opens not with spectacle, but with subtlety. If any part of this exploration echoed something in your own life, consider offering just one line, even to yourself, about what resonated, not as confession and not as performance, but as a way of noticing that your inner architecture is neither strange nor solitary. There are many sealed temples still standing. Many are still waiting for someone who knows how to approach with reverence. And if this conversation touched into layers that feel heavier than expected, grief, loneliness, old wounds resurfacing, remember that support from a therapist, counselor, or trusted adult can provide grounding that no video alone can offer. It is not a sign of weakness to seek steadier footing. It is a sign that the temple deserves care, not abandonment. For now, let this final thought settle. You were never hard to know. You simply needed someone who understood the value of what you carry.